Hello everyone, today we talk about the citizenship tax during the 12th century Italian communes that we come back to discuss after a while. And this time, as you understand, in a moment that we haven't looked much into, but it's importantly constitutive of the what we have later seen as mostly the city-states that start to appear properly as such during the 13th century as a political institutional profile, right? I should give a bit of background in here because, of course, terminology is fundamental, and this part of it is not that easy, right? It's complex. There are certain specific stages, certain specific terms. Italian historiography is also gradually adjusting these things because it's one of those topics that shows you how much the Middle Ages is still to be truly assessed in the fundamentals. Naturally, we have a good level of understanding of certain dynamics that are also basically the best documented out there, at least given the peculiarity of properly the city-state as it's been forming. I was planning to introduce maybe something more in-depth, given that from this year we went beyond the usual manualistic approach in the medieval history videos and looking at things more consistently in detail, right? I could, if you're interested, I don't know how much, but this is I think it's worth it. We could even start specifically a series dedicated to these changes in the Italian communes. Surely we will be discussing them, especially from an evidential point of view. These are essentially the times that of Frederick I and the campaigns of the emperor against the Lombard League and all the changes that ensued from the outcome of this. The topic we address today is just really a thought. Is this thing of the city tax, the citizenship taxes, let's say it more properly, that was established in the second half of the 12th century in a world like the communal one, where it was actually the military aristocracy that was in charge of the political, judicial sphere, had the majority of landed property there, so the actual wealth of the commune passed through this. The topic of the so-called militia, because that's fundamentally the militia as in the medieval sense, right? The miles, as you know in Latin, is technically the soldier. He's the guy who receives the pay, and it's pretty standard, right? So much that, think about the late Roman army when we speak of, I don't know, the magister militum is of all the soldiers. Then it was divided in, there were the subcommands of magister equitum and magister peditum. In the Middle Ages, the term miles basically comes to identify the one of eques, at least as a terminal, as a technical term to define those who fought on horseback, right? Which is not entirely the same thing, because also in medieval sources, middle medieval sources, you find, equites as, the cavalrymen, generally speaking. But here, the miles, as we know from the 10th century in Europe, we made some videos about this topic, about knighthood, is this new properly military class, right? Not in a classistic sense, but properly the idea that these are the guys who have the cingulum militaris that basically can afford, because this is the initial criterion, right? Socially speaking, things were still relatively fluid, and even in here in 12th century Italy, in part it was, right? There would be a sort of lock of the militia proper. Because if I say militia in English, it sounds like, the militia it's the opposite of what we're talking about in here. The militia is, in the conventional term, would be the paramilitary units in a certain sense that fit more to the peditas, to the the common, the rest of the people, those who fought on foot, right? Instead, here the militia is a technical term to refer specifically to the knights, right? Not even, just to make you understand the complexity of this, because there is also a semantic shade. Not all the milites were technically knights, as we, as far as the dubbing process that the investiture conferred them as such, but de facto those who fought on horseback, because in the Italian communes, the noblemen were not the feudal aristocracy properly meant. There was somebody who, as we will see also in here with William of the Fifth of Montferrat, that makes the example we discussed today, were actually part of the highest imperial, properly the feudality, right? And also siding with the emperor at that point during the wars in northern Italy. But they are properly all those citizens that here we start. It's not even it's still a fluid term, is getting defined, in fact, through this citizenship tax meaningfully, that can afford the panoply, the war horse, right? Those who actually live like that. And it's not much a matter of affording, because as we will be discussing for the 13th century, for example, when the people, the popolo, as it was called, the populus in Latin, or in Italian, in the earlier case, takes over, right, and basically starts to restrain, to contain, and sometimes even to make purges of the milites, right, of the knights. The thing would be more like an imposition, right? The people, the commoners, had become importantly rich. Here, Italy during the 12th, 13th centuries, rocketing in terms of sheer material wealth. These are, as we remembered many times, it's literally the country with the highest wealth per capita in the world, in the entire world at the time. Merchants or other landowners that were, however, not noble, that start making a lot of money, but they're not about war. They've never been about that. On the contrary, they've always been about trade, about transactions, about essentially a civilian life. After the knights' purges, they are requested by the popolo that has in the meanwhile taken over in several places, not all of them, not all the Italian city-states, but a consistent part of them, to serve, or at least to provide a cavalryman, a knight, right, for the city army, for the communal army. We made videos about the Italian communal army's organization and maybe not organizations, tactics, if I remember correctly, last year, that touched a bit these topics, but not entirely. In the 12th century, instead, the reality is, as it was since the beginning of the communes, from between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century, all those, yes, that could fight, there wasn't much of a difference. It was all about those who could fight on horseback, right? And their families, their clans, fundamentally ruled the city. The consuls, like that were the highest communal magistracy, were extracted from these families. They controlled the tribunals. They basically managed, city life a bit as a mob, right? These were clans, right, of military men. They didn't have properly they had a municipal ethos, but there wasn't really a state, like a real public authority. It is something that is starting to rise instead towards the end of the 12th century, 13th, where also the people, the commoners, need that kind of stability, because these military clans were dramatically violent, as you can imagine, and they actually had helped, however, the development of the commune, because the Italian communes have essentially a military origin, right? The concept that there has to be a community in arms, where technically everybody's a nobleman as long as they can bear arms. It's like back in the Germanic order, right? Or the Roman one, right? It's the concept that every chiefess that is not even properly conceived like that, but he's as a freeman, can bear arms, and these communities this is recognized widely, if you read Verbogen, etc., are the first good, proper infantry, also armies, that are to be found out there in the Middle Ages, as they are naturally dominated by knighthood that is basically identical to the one of the other countries, except for this thing that they're not technically part of the feudal system, but just they're noble on the base of wealth, but that are organized, military speaking, and the knights naturally lead these military expeditions. They are the ones who raid, ransom, take the ransoms, the booty, and reinvest it in their landed estates, and the city profits from that, because this whole business revolves around the city, right? Italy makes an exception because there is no other place in Europe where technically the city is the central, it's the center of control of the countryside. In the other countries, it's the other way around. There is a landlord and then cities that more or less fall in their control. In here, and this is what Barbarossa was shocked by when he arrived from Germany, where there was a very different reality. South of the Alps, he finds these, councils of essentially commoners, of people that were not part of the feudal hierarchy, that rule, that dictate law, basically, on the actual noblemen, in the countryside. And that's still Holy Roman Empire. There's something must be done of it. And Frederick is clever at some level to exploit these monstrous reality in his own eyes, but he also decides to curb this communities because they were dramatically rich. They weren't paying essentially imperial rights anymore, because the empire had eclipsed from Italy since the previous century. And also the wars with the Lombard League rise, that, however, bring, as you know, to the defeat of the emperor, with a dynamic that is quite clear in outline, because actually Barbarossa had arrived in Italy with the intention of curbing Milan, because there were other Italian Lombard cities that had been bullied by the bigger center. The Milanese had literally began to expand even beyond their city districts, right? But at the end of the war, those same cities had sided with Milan, because they realized that when Frederick had arrived, his aim was to literally take all the revenues, all the imperial rights. That is what most of these cities lived off in terms of sheer, they had built it themselves. There was no other community that had produced so much in the whole empire. And the imperial objective was to dry all these resources off. And at that point, this city said, wait a minute, is this what we were looking for? And that's how the thing answered. It was a brutal thing. As you know, Milan was razed to the ground. The Milanese rebuilt it from scratch. It was basically the largest city in Europe at the time. The brutality, it's kind of strange. I think I made a video about the Battle of Legnano back in the day, but I think I'll remake it at some point, because some videos are so old that they're not even well researched, or they don't even talk about true sources. But let's say those are important milestones, even just in medieval warfare in the annals of military history. There is a very important performance of infantries in terms of European infantry. At this point, the Italians are at the peak of it. They will maintain it up to basically the beginning of the 14th century. And there is a lot of, examples shown here. Also, the other commoners across Europe that objectively even a common pedes, a common infantryman, could keep at bay a noble knight, which was something like the world gone upside down. But we know this is the same thing eventually will happen with the Flemish, with the Scots, etc. But aside from this, and this is just to give you a picture of what we're talking about in practice, because when we speak of milites and pedites, right, we're talking about not just the components of the communal army. We're talking also about two distinct, say, social groups that, of course, are intersected, because, of course, the pedites initially are part of the clienteles of the military clans. And as we've seen, they grew also thanks to the milites. As a matter of fact, the commune is created in practice through the military aristocracy. There is all a prehistory of this, in the sense that one has to look back at the times of the counts, bishops in Ottonian times, the continuity with in Italy from of municipal organizations from Roman to medieval times. There is a lot to dig in here, and this is not very. These topics are often overlooked, right? Because it sounds like it's not the Middle Ages, right? The Middle Ages, at a certain point, there is a dark hole somewhere between antiquity and the Middle Ages, but the truth is that this is a kind of a bit of a North-centric view. When you look at Mediterranean history, you realize there is a dramatic continuity, and in urbanistic terms, Italy is definitely the best example for obvious reasons with Roman times. But not only that, we have properly, as we were saying before, as a pattern of state building. Right, when we arrive to talk about the Renaissance of humanism, right, of centers like Florence, that at this time, for example, were relatively secondary, right? They were all communes, right? They all had more or less their own thing. What is striking of low medieval Italy is how homogeneous all the political, military, and social practices basically in the center, in the north, actually were, right? The Italic kingdom and the Papal States were here. The era of commune in the south of the peninsula didn't quite have that. They had an important urbanism, but the feudal kingdom of the Normans, of the Swabians, of the Angevins, eventually, keeps in check what were actually the most precocious, actually, urban, communal experiences at a certain level. But the center in the north is, in fact, what we look at when we think of the Renaissance most of the times. And when we think of the Renaissance, we think about astonishing modernity, right? The idea of the modern state built in the political theory of Florence, the important levels of centralization, the fact that these lands, as we've explained, multiple occasions pass in the time span of a generation from just like 30 city-states that are fighting one against the other to essentially regional states in the early 14th century. And it's a deep topic because it shows you what the creation of a state, the idea that from nothing we arrived in many other contexts in history, basically all of them, to something that is able to build a state, that there is not just a pregressed authority that arrives and makes the state, right? Frederick Barbarossa in Germany didn't have a state. It had a feudal system that he implemented himself to even hope to keep everything glued together, and it didn't even succeed. This centers here without a head, because technically there is a kingdom but no king. There is an emperor, but there's an empire, but no emperor for them. Or at least when he arrives, they fight against him, and they don't want. They of course want. They are in the empire. They never deny imperial authority. They even owe something to the emperor in terms of rights, even at the Peace of Constance in 1183 after the victory of Legnano. But they want to stay autonomous. They want to make their own money, as they've always done. And in there, you see through these struggles between the knights and the commoners, the necessity of creating a centralized system. The necessity of creating a state properly meant. That is what the military clans, as basically an offspring of feudal, of that reality, as Western Europe was at this point, set on, wouldn't accept in a measure. Those were good for putting together the city, to define also violently, militarily, its boundaries, its district, its shared, its concentration of wealth in the city, and its shared interests. The creation of the commune, even if they're important magistracies, but when it comes to create something else in terms of administration, something that will eventually confer the cities even a greater power, right? The people comes in, because these people fundamentally are lamenting, as we will see today, that the militia doesn't pay taxes. This is very important. How the communal tax system functions is actually complex. We'll talk about another time, but to make the long story short, these knights and their families, because among the militia there were, the leaders that were proper knights, military men. They spent a lifetime in horseback. They fought as as military professionals. But they in their clans you could find some other important gifted morally and materially individuals. You find judges, notaries, also important businessmen. I mean, there is in there the intelligentsia, if you want, of the commune. When the middle classes start enriching dramatically, and there are interesting stages between, especially the with the victory against the first Frederick I and then Frederick II, right, where naturally an enormous amount of wealth is also invested in war and burned in war, basically. But this was done exactly because they knew that by fighting for their own freedom, they would get ever more money afterwards, and that's exactly what happened. There's properly the enormous enrichment of the middle classes, so much that when we talk about the struggles between the milites and the pedites, or the milites and the populace, the people, we're not literally talking about just the knights and the infantrymen, right? Because also the popolo eventually would have its own knights, right? They had their own magnates, they had their own men of power, they had the material means. We made a video back in the day on the incredible material wealth of these communities. As we were saying before, this had a world primate, right? Nobody had ever seen all that wealth concentrated. These had the means. If you wonder even just why they had the means to train their troops, to keep them, to develop so much. Italy at this point is, together with France, that they had technological advancements, right, in the military field. There is a hole in historiography that hasn't rendered proper justice to the actual development, military development, in comparison to other European countries, especially between the 12th and the 13th century of these areas, because these guys had armies that kingdoms had back in the day, but nobody cares because these were not kingdoms, right? And so it's like, it's just like the stereotype of the evil Lombard in the Carolingian legion, that these guys are just rich and but they're treacherous. They don't think they're not much of even of a good military man and so on. This is a hard to die stereotype. It's very much out there, but when you actually study in detail what these realities were about, you say, wow, did we miss that, like in Western popular culture? Like, do we need to why did we cross this out, essentially? Why don't we just get interested in some of the greatest European advancements of the time? Well, because it's cultural. It's mostly, as always, a modern problem of people that, of course, do not know much about history, not even just medieval one, in the first place, and they follow just what is out there, and they don't think there can be something more interesting, because this is where you want to look at. And however, that's why we discuss this stuff in the first place. And naturally, we will make a lot of videos. We didn't make much. We talk a lot about the Italian communes chiefly because of these civil development, but made a very few. Never spoke much about military stuff here and there. Just some example, but mostly all together with the rest of Europe, mostly Western Europe, telling the truth, because there is a big hole to cover there, even just for Northern Eastern Europe, the Central Europe, that we still haven't done properly. We're not talking about Spain, or even, well, yeah, we really have a lot to do here. But the point here is that under war is the key to understand much of these developments. Basically, you can't study, this is what I began to do from some time, the Italian communal developments through important military situation. That is essentially the wars against Frederick I, and eventually the ones against Frederick II, then the ones followed basically with the conquest of southern Italy by the Angevins, and which actually was already progressing over time as an ever more agitated situation. And there is a dramatic intensification of warfare in this area. This is Contamine basically stated that Italy at this point was the most warlike. In terms of sheer belligerence, in terms of resources invested, people, frequency of wars, of pitched battles, this is the most belligerent area in Europe, as a matter of fact. And especially between the the two wars with the Hohenstaufen, there is these important steps that you can measure. Why? Also because the pettites we were speaking about before are the ones who start dramatically showing their capability on the battlefield, right? Battles like Carcano, Dagnano, eventually in the wars against Frederick II, too, they're very important episodes of that kind. These guys are able to resist the charges of heavy cavalry, of imperial knights. At this time, were also growing at the acme of their strength, right? In medieval warfare, this is not the time in which infantry still can make it alone, right? But most of them at the time were not even expected to hold the ground against cavalry charges. These guys are able to do for an entire day of fight, and even sometimes to pass to counterattack. There's an aggressive capabilities of these infantries, and therefore the pettites who achieve these victories, or at least that better allow the knights eventually to collect them, are the ones that, when you come back home in the city, are starting to ask for more recognition. Not just because of this result, but because literally in the city streets, these are even more warring for the same mounted elite in combat, right? In narrow city streets, cavalry does fight and like hell, but it's much greater disadvantage than in open ground. So if these guys barely make it to defeat knights in open field, in the city streets, that's even, they are even more powerful, and they're starting to demand a lot at a political and institutional level, in terms of representants, but especially in terms of money, because at the end of the day, that's what it revolves around. And the nobility at this point, that's what I stopped actually. I remember I came back circularly at this point by digressing. The nobility, the knights, do not pay taxes. That is to say, they are the major landowners, right? But they're so privileged, and they have so many privileges at many levels, right? They don't pay so many taxes in this field. If I don't know, if a war horse gets crippled in battle, the community has to pay to refund them. There is all a system of frauds going on with that. But I mean, they have a very heavy impact on the city economy, and the people start saying, well, why don't they pay taxes, right? Of course, before they were in charge, so they were the actual ones who treated the city as a private business. But now, things have changed, right? And especially after the war against Frederick II, it was obvious that things couldn't come back like before, because infantry and people had showed they could take what they wanted. And they wanted these people, these magnates, to pay taxes on their possessions, which we're talking about a huge amount of money for the communal incomes, right? It's not a bit more, a bit less. It's just a massive structural asset that at this point nobody has ever had the possibility to touch, because these clans, as the mob, were ruling with iron fist, and they wouldn't care about anybody, right? They would mess up, in their vendettas on the city streets. They would start, city battles, destroying shops, things. The people started being upset about this because they lost a freaking lot of money to shut everything down, to see their houses destroyed, and so on. So the idea is that you have to stop that, right? And if you don't do it with good manners, we take up arms, and that's where things get seriously messed up, because remember that there is no better individual in medieval warfare that understands the potential of infantry as the knight, right? The myth that that medieval knights were a bunch of cocky bastards that didn't give a damn about infantry. They didn't even think that they could do something. It's stupid, right? One is the cultural prejudice, of course. The knights in Italy, maybe, yeah, it was the same thing, but this is more even at where, you know, the feudality was more developed, like in France, like in England, etc., in Germany. They were considered subhumans. They were considered beasts, right? Especially the peasantry. In fact, the same Italian citizens believed that the same thing of peasants themselves, because of course they were, you know, kind of more enlightened. They were dramatically rich, educated, literate, etc. since centuries, right? So they also start developing their elites that sometimes had this unparalleled wealth that starts even landing to kingdoms, to kings themselves. That's the sheer magnitude of these centers' wealth. But the idea is that the knights know perfectly well what is taken to win a battle in open field, in siege, and they use infantry all the freaking time, right? And this is true for everywhere in Europe, right? And we have definitely a lot of examples of cooperation between knights and infantry, so that they knew their deal, right? Italy was one of those places that was also, for example, developing crossbow the most. Why? Right? Because they had some magic formula, know how to make a crossbow. Crossbows had always existed in Europe, even during the early Middle Ages. The reasons, as always, in military history, not technological, are political and social. The Italians have this dramatically numerous middle classes that do not like the militants very much, and therefore they start using crossbows, because those are typical popular weapons that do not look at rank, status, whatever. They just shoot down the freaking thing. Horse, knight maybe not, because they're armored enough, but still they can't harm them in that way as well. And war becomes pretty damn crude, right? Here's the idea that the people is evil. Let's face it. Historically speaking, all the major popular revolts and even the middle classes emergence, they are dramatically more ferocious, evil. They want to kill. The militants do not want to do this, right? There are instances in the same communal Italy where you can imagine there were all these city-states were like a few tens of kilometers one from the other. So there was always the usual bitchy neighbor that you made war with, and the people is tired of war and say, let's raise the freaking city to the ground so we don't have anything to do with them. This is happening in Florence against Arezzo, for example, and the knights said, wait, slow down. If we destroy that city, who are we going to make war with? That is, where are we profiting as noblemen, as knights, through raiding, kidnapping, looting, and so on with, right? It's two very different mindsets, right? But the people is even more evil, and frankly, is not, aside from civilian matters, doesn't understand much war, right? Doesn't understand much the concept that through war, through the investment in a professional army, you can achieve great things. This is the harsh lesson that eventually lordships will teach to the Italian communes, that are the same ones who make lordship rise, but exactly for this reason, that the most popular oriented communes are crushed fundamentally by a coming back eventually in the lordship's times of cavalry, of professionalism, because the people simply feared the rise of someone would be too powerful. And this is the typical story of the elite and of the people, that it's not necessarily like the elite is evil and the people are brave and pure and free because they decide to have. No, most of it, civilization passes through elites, passes through oligarchies, and that's not surprising. The most successful Italian communes will be the ones who have the most powerful oligarchies. Whether, doesn't matter what their structure was. They could be popular at some point, but they were still oligarchic magnate merchants, right? That were the ones who had that freaking amount of money. And or the lords that hired mercenaries, but they leave us, in fact, but that's the history of late Middle Ages. We have seen it in other videos. Now there is no problem to, let's focus on the 12th century, because that's where here interesting things are taking place. And another thing is why war is important is that, of course, war accelerates the needs of centralization. War needs unity of command, and that's also why the knights, telling the truth, they are good at making war, right, individually. But since even the consular magistrate, the regime, that's how it worked through, was a collegial office, right, and all these clans were trying to counterbalance each other. Of course, they weren't the best to have a single unit of power, right? That's also why the people will call these figures of the podestas, that are basically, leaders with a markedly military character, of military unit of command, proper as military mandate, where yes, there was a mandate from the commune as the political authority, but these guys were entrusted war altogether, the command of the army altogether, at least for the strictly operational level, because it was a problem. Like, that's the Middle Ages. There was no thing like a centralized command, right? A communal army before this times would come on the field, like with all the various noblemen who had agreed more or less how to do. The infantry would follow like those, but in battlefield, the pitched battles were pretty rare, right? Or maybe not so much, but let's say that they were still, kind of exceptional events, and they fundamentally took different paths sometimes, especially also during the same campaign. It wasn't much in battle because they knew their business, but what direction to take, on which district we pass, which path we take, that meant to literally shift enormous assets, because, passing through that road would have enriched dramatically one of that family rather than the other, would have discontented the neighbor that was maybe allied with a faction. All these problems that you can imagine are not good when you have to make war, because you need to be quick and rapid and focused and precise. So the wars with Frederick II had exposed the Italian communes to this important pressure from a military point of view. And let's say that so the campaigns were between the 50s and the end of the 50s and the beginnings of the 80s of the 12th century, right? And war freaking costs a lot, right? A lot. Therefore, here the citizenship tax is introduced, right? Gradually, because this began not from a day to another, but the idea was literally you have to fund the army. You have to buy the food, the floor. You have to pay for the horses' forage, the same horses, the equipment, the mercenaries, right? So money has to be found. So these were initially exceptional measures that take the name, at least I think in Italian historiography it's called cittadinatico, which means literally like the tax about the city, something like that. But specifically the idea of the citizenship, that is, whoever lived in the city now was assuming an ever more a better defined identity properly as a member of that community, and therefore had to respond politically of that. So there is a frequency in the increase of this tax request. So the citizenship tax was basically an act of citizenship that entailed for the military aristocracy to undergo the same tax and military burdens of the other people in the city, right? And this is particularly important because there is a distinction to do. Like, who are the cives proper? Who are the citizens, right? The majority of the military aristocracy had, as we've seen, possessions in the countryside, right? The countryside, here the contado, the comitatum, because that's basically where it came from. It was the ancient comital repartition of Roman, Lombard, Frankish times that, especially from the 10th century, was There was obviously, since the, Roman times, the center of the city and the dioceses. So there was the city district with the city and the dioceses, and all the city administration revolved around this territory, right? So it's not a territory like another. The military aristocracy owned properties all across this in the city. Think about the famous house towers, house fortresses of the medieval Italian landscapes, still to be seen in certain cities like San Gimignano or Bologna. And in the countryside, however, overwhelmingly, because naturally the base of wealth, pre-industrial society was the land, right? And this land sometimes was also scattered across other city districts, right? These were lineages that were also more, if you want, more international than the city. The city had important international trade relations, of course, but there was still an empire there, still royalty there. Speaking of William Montferrat, before, we're talking about people who literally were the tip of the balance in the whole Mediterranean and European policy. I mean, look at the Montferrats in Jerusalem, in the same Italy during the wars with the Barbarossa, who were allies of the empire. Whatever move they take, they change everything in German policy, in Italian policy, even in Byzantine policy, in the Crusader states policy. It was there was a dramatic international projection of these feudal families. So their interests were naturally and traditionally, let's say, more towards, can't say against the city, because as we've seen, the city was their creation, but surely they still wished to become something, like to climb the feudal ladder, if we can say like that. And while the city, just as we've seen, wanted to remain alone, right, which was utopistic, because they couldn't be left alone. Even if they had defeated the emperor, it was, as we've seen, always the city next door would start harassing you. You had to do something about that. That's also why the people was kind of not really schizophrenic, but was blind in the face of the same opportunity that war provided, with that the knights instead were dramatically aware of, right? And that's why they more or less remained in charge as milites, as properly as knights, in also the command of the armies, right? It was never a sharp cut between, at one point were just the people that commanded or just the knights that commanded. That's something we'll have to discuss and cover carefully, because also every city here we're skipping any kind of local distinction, but we'll have to do that because every city had a different history telling the truth regarding these things. But this is exactly the point, that the city up to that point had, and the same knights through the consular government had exacted tolls on the city itself. Right now it was the city was saying, we don't have to be the only ones who pay. If you're a knight who has a beautiful house tower in the city from which he lords around and bullies and molests and sheds blood and so on, and you have this freaking huge estates in the countryside, you start paying, right? If you are a citizen, otherwise you're freaking out of the city, right? You don't want to pay, we don't make you stay here. You have to pay for all your property, right? That's the point. That's the big impacting distinction, because through this process you see that the city is extending the control in the countryside. This is the let's say the rise of the people. These are the first steps. The people is moving properly also in an offensive sense towards the milites, but it's doing it politically through extending the city control on the countryside. That will be in fact a typical popular policy. They will never fully subdue the countryside, right? There will always remain some lineage that did whatever they wanted. There were naturally the neighboring cities that backed the exiles within the same districts of origin to harass the city, to attack the logistical chain, because of course the city lived, as we've seen, because of the countryside surplus. That's why a city existed in the first place. So it's a vicious thing, right? The communes will, the people will fail in the end in this broader time we can start between 1150 1350. There is the kind of a parabola of the popular movement that at a certain point will crumble for many reasons. But in the process, for sure, the people starts creating a true idea of centralized public authority, right? The idea that, of course, it's centralized is too modernistic as a term. It's the idea that there is a common good. This is how they like to phrase it, right? That it's the res publica. It's, of course, of Roman inspiration. There was at this time also, literally speaking, many revivals of these ideas. Considering that, of course, the city had to be theoretically united. It had to make common choices, what it was best for all, right, on average. And objectively, in conditions like those of constant war and threat for the same city, exacting this money was something necessary, right? And when the wars with Barbarossa are over, the communes boom, economically speaking. The middle classes increase further their power, so they do not give up the idea that even in peacetime, there can't say there never was fully, because there was always some disturbance, there was always some expedition, there was always this kind of typical seasonal warfare against the enemy district, all this stuff. They keep needing the citizenship tax because they are starting to build that as their own prerogative, as the fact that they can ask for all those who live in the city that wherever they are, they have to contribute with their means to the communal cause, which is a fair idea, right? Of course, the means through which these were enforced were not fair, were not just in the sense proper that we know today. They were done on the tip of the spear, right? But still, that expresses a political struggle as it happens historically pretty much everywhere, and that built something that, especially in the 13th century, will boom as the acme of communal civilization, or at least of that specific type, because later with humanism and Renaissance, it's another story, but it's still fruit, consequence of these first efforts. Considering all this, as we're saying, that the militants had mixed interests, right? They were interested in playing within the city, but also remaining on the countryside on their own, right? Everybody was doing what was more convenient for them, as always. But there is this example. So first of all, these citizens' taxes, that's how I also phrased them. I don't know whether it's technically the best way of doing it, but it sounds, at least in English, it aims at it pretty well. I mean, it's literally, the idea is that there's a citizenry that demands you this contribution. And in every city, this happened in different ways, but also, naturally, these acts of citizenry were enacted in relation to the political weight of the contractors. These were pacts, right? It wasn't done just like at some point the people rises and imposes this. No, it was always a game between the factions, right, and whoever ruled the city. And we have this example I'll talk to you about today from 1180 that invests a figure of enormous prestige, as we were saying before, that is the Marquis William V of Montferrat. Montferrat was this marquisate of very ancient origin. These are properly the relics of the ancient feudal system, let's say, if you can call it in this sense, that had survived as landed power in Italy as isles in between this broader urban phenomenon that had sucked the nobility into the city itself. So these were, as we were saying, bloody feudatories, military aristocracy of the finest stock. They participated in the crusades, they had major involvements in all these wars, etc. They sided with the emperor, right? And Otto of Freising had deemed William some decade before, that is before Barbarossa's campaign, one of the rare great lords that had remained free of the communal imperium, literally. You know that Otto Freising is in Barbarossa's time the one that documents what this Italian exception had been about, right? The idea, this incredible thing of that such high lords like these would be under communal power, right? Here, properly the communal imperium. When Otto writes about this, he's very careful about his word. He's literally saying that, of course, the imperium, because the communes had monopolized the imperial rights. They were exercising that, which ideologically speaking, consider that here we're talking about, when we talk about the wars with the Lombard League, we're talking also about the clash between the emperor and the papacy. It's a broader universal issue, right? So the Romanity, the imperial nature of these powers means that if there is an emperor out there that lets his rights being usurped by one of his subjects, there is something that doesn't work quite right, right? It's not that Frederick had many hostility towards this thing happening. He just was coming back to Italy to reclaim what by law was his, right? And he had allies among several communes, as we were saying. In these wars, there was always some Italian that participated with him, right? They had something to gain. In a highly politically fragmented reality like that one, of course, the factions, more or less, towards the end, it's mostly against the emperor, but there is always somebody who helps in that sense. And the Germans also are a bit like that. This is where there is an hostility. Most Germans do not give a damn about Italy. They don't want to spend money to campaign there, right? The Swabians that are clever know that, of course, if they conquer Italy, they can hope to reunite East and West to be the sole Roman emperors. They went a step away before 50 years before, 40 years before the French and the Venetians to seize Constantinople, right? The Hohenstaufen dream, Mediterranean dream, was not a chimera, right? They knew they could theoretically curb these communities and become literally the richest rulers of in the world. And at this point, they were actually in Europe. The Swabians here are at the peak of their power. They're more powerful, yes, than France. They're more powerful than they have mostly the Byzantines as their competitors, but they're fundamentally the greatest power in Central Europe. So consider even here the capacity of these leagues to stand their ground against such a might, right? It could reunite easily at some point so many lands and have this dramatic influence as far as as the Balkans, as the here we have to reason in at a large scale of political relevance of these events, not just in a localistic sense. And that's why what we mostly forget about the Middle Ages. We mostly deal with the Middle Ages as in modern national terms. That is, we look at the major kingdoms / countries as we want to project them in the past, and we think that was the thing. No, the thing was strictly more local from one side and strictly universal from the other. And that's where the world things, the single most important things floated. And that's why the Holy Roman Empire is overlooked, right? German history, Italian history at this point are worth being studied very much, right? There is not just other, here it's literally, especially in the 12th century, it's literally the main axis of balance in Europe. So for Otto Freising, that was admiring these realities because he observed this monstrous thing of commoners ruling over noblemen of blood, but he was also appreciating the fact that these Italian populations were they were literate, for example, which north of the Alps was kind of a rare. It looked at their administrative capacities. When Frederick I arrives in Italy, the first thing he does, of course, is to hire the Bolognese masters of law to reaffirm the Romanity of the imperial legitimacy. There is really the fascination with state building, right? Barbarossa in Germany imports feudalism of Western Frankish origin to start to give a unity to this Germany. It was organized fundamentally alongside the path of the so-called ethnic duchies. But when he comes out of the Alps, he of course has plenty of style material to play with, right? And that's why they wanted to centralize in a place like, hopefully, Rome itself, the empire, right? Because the other lands were a nightmare. Frederick couldn't expand in Germany as he could expand in Italy, right? It was even just it was not just difficult to do militarily speaking, but it was also less productive, right? As events proved, not even in Italy it was easy at all. In fact, he didn't succeed. But still, the profit, had he won, would have been far superior. Well, the same William of Montferrat that had supported Frederick Barbarossa loyally, but after Legnano in 1176, the world system collapsed, right? There was a brutal international contraction of the Swabian capacity with all powers, right? Up to the Ottoman states and the Byzantine Empire. It was a dramatic blow to imperial power. William is obliged to pass to the other field, and in the process, with his son Conrad, he swore what in Latin was called the Habitaculum of Vercelli. Was a commune, right? So the Habitaculum here stands for the citizenry, as we were saying before. The idea of the inhabitment, we could translate it like from Latin, which means that he basically accepted, as a marquis that had massive properties in northwestern Italy as a rural feudal lord, a rural lord, to tie himself to this city of Vercelli that basically brought him to urbanize institutionally, right? He swore the Habitaculum, so he legally said, okay, I'm part of this. And together with his son, by the way, he committed himself to buy a house in the city, right? So that was also another very important formality. The idea you literally enter within the city. The city was considered like a universe on its own in the Middle Ages. Like, it's not a random place, right? Consider that. So Vercelli wasn't that big, but you know, as we've seen, Italy had the largest cities at the time. And so, you know, numerous, so thickly in the territory. And so this was entering in a world of that kind. It's a political war, it's a military war, it's an institutional war. So he enters in the city, he swears, right? And he commits himself to pay the fodrum of the Vercelli commune, which equated to something like 10,000 pavese pounds, which was a lot. The fodrum, I think if you know medieval history, you know what it is. I mean, it was one of the most important imperial rights on the communities, because it consisted fundamentally in the provisions for the army. That is, when the emperor passed with the army, these various communities had to provide especially for the horses, right? The forage for the horses, the stables, keeping, you know, logistically these armies going throughout the imperial territory. Here, everything had started to be monetized, right? So, in fact, we see here the 10,000 pavese pounds that are the equivalent of it, because these are properly and imperial rights that are recognized as such. This tells you let's say, how much these cities were, of course, fully in mindset, were fully within the empire. There was no secessionistic tendency of any sort. No commune here fighting against the emperor had ever remotely even imagined that they could be out of the empire. They were just contesting the payment, right? Who had to get such revenues, right? And this is important because it's not that they used it just to, do something, they literally also paid their own army like that. So this is fascinating because we'll have to dwell on this because it's overlooked as a factor. But I mean, the idea that there was still a sense that the empire was owned by those who could win it with arms is something that stands at the base also of the Lombard League and its efforts, the Lombard League, the Veronese League, that had mobilized against the emperor. Right, because it's literally a challenge. Yes, it's true that the communal mindset, especially as far as the people was concerned, it's not that cared much about whether, ideally this was them winning the imperial authority, right, in a military sense. But of course it was an enormous pride, an enormous sense of themselves. I mean, the resistance of the Lombard League was something atrocious. These people were capable of shooting down, shooting over the children that the Germans tied over their own siege towers where they're storming the cities. They would fight. I mean, even the smallest city would oppose this atrocious resistance, knowing that they would have lost, they would have been razed to the ground, they would have been exterminated, their families would have been deported. They didn't even then. That's how determined they were. And as we know from Clausewitz's studies, those are the moral forces that are needed to win a war. And there is a beautiful literature in Germany describing these wars. The anti-Barbarossa one, because as we've seen, there was also the anti-Swabian plot. But I mean, there was this in Reinhard Fuchs, for example. There is a beautiful picture of Barbarossa. There's a lion that decides to tame the ants, and there are all these various nests, that would have been the various Italian communes of these tiny little ants that are so small, tiny, but there are so many. And the lion at the end loses, and he breaks down, and he dies, right? That was the symbol of the empire shattered, actually. It's a beautiful piece of literature if you ever study that. It's also very funny, telling the truth. It's quite irreverent. It's an Alsatian work, but it's worth the read. It was speaking exactly of these contexts here. So, what I would like to stress here, however, is that this commitment by side of William of Montferrat is not much of this international struggle. It's also a local meaning, right? The citizenry tax was in this case an instrument of political agreement, right? In order to resolve the vivacious contrasts that opposed, in this case, the two main factions of the Vercelli district that were one against the other, and not an act of submission, more or less than a definitive subjection, let's say, to the powerful marginal family of Montferrat to an enemy commune like Vercelli, right? We don't have to read it like that, because the commune doesn't have that power properly, especially in this case. The commune, however, now, and this is really the fundamental, why this thing had been done in the first place, through this agreement, now could count on the very consistent tax contribution of the Montferrat family. It was enormous, right? And this was for the house of which we could say represented in Vercelli a good granting de facto the fulfillment of the agreement. Right. This was a way of saying, for the side of Montferrat, I legally recognize that I have to pay now these taxes as a proof that I am contracting now this agreement to put an end to this district feuds that were evidently damaging him at the same time, and also extending his own control in part, obviously, on the city itself, because he was the one who was putting the money in that at the same time, right? So he surely had of course he could retract in a sense. Legally it would have not functioned, because now the commune of Vercelli could have said, you paid that, right? You agreed that you signed that, you bought a house in here, so there is no doubt whatsoever. So this was just a form of payment, of agreement, as many others that were existing at this time, on a very complex set of relations that at some point we'll have to start covering in detail, and that exemplifies the deep connections existing between the communes and landlords, and gradually the emergence of the commune as a force capable of extending its control on the countryside. That is exactly at the very end. Here we see the Peace of Constance would be in 1183. The hostilities had already ceased, but I mean, Legnano was the major blow. But the emperor had come in Lombardy exactly to stop a commune like Milan to expand on the countryside, to start threatening other cities, other communities. Well, at this point, the grip is loosened, right? And these cities start doing very interesting stuff in their own district and beyond, right? And they start building a power that, especially from the mid-13th century, will be capable of creating a new different system, fundamentally concentrated on the city and the district, and as a ever more central government that at that point would be essentially not really the only interlocutor in the political scene, but surely a major force, authority, the public power, and what could what also other figures that were interested to rule would try to climb in order to create eventually even something more, as we were saying before, multi-city domains, and eventually regional states. But that's that process of state building that passes all within the city, and we'll have to see at some point. Anyhow, for now we stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.